Welcome back to the program. Great to have you with me. It's May 1st. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, tell your friends and families. Appreciate the support. Want to check in on some economic data and a little talk about tariffs in Canada. When we think about public policy, fiscal policy, or monetary policy, we have to consider lag effects. The time it takes to recognize a problem, the time it takes to consider a solution, and the time it takes for the solution, once enacted, to impact the economy. And those lag effects can vary between fiscal policy and monetary policy and the type of action taken. And so oftentimes when we consider when a president owns the economy, I'm using my air quotes, it's usually mid-year of the year they took office. So think June, July-ish, before the policies they put in place begin to impact the economy compared to the policies that were in place in the prior administration that are still impacting the economy in January, February, March, April. And so if you were to analyze economic performance by president through the past, you want to put some lag effect in the data collected such that a presidency's ownership of an economy began maybe June of their year they took office through June of the year they leave office. Yet some data this week that we received on trade and growth indicates that President Trump, given his fast action, unusual, unprecedented action, disruptive action on trade, immigration, government spending, he now has ownership of some of these things. And we can think about that first when it comes to trade and the release of the advanced international trade deficit goods only for the month of March, $162 billion deficit, a new record high, up 9.6% from the prior month. A massive number, up 14.1 billion from February. Exports from February up 2.2 billion, imports up 16.3 billion. Holy cow, massive, massive increase. Now, prior to mid-2024, goods trade deficits were in the mid 80s to low 90 billions a month. Since mid-2024, and certainly since November of 2024, these numbers have gone up well above 100 billion, and we have a new record here at 162 billion for March. As importers front run the tariffs that Trump is threatening to impose, although waffling on regularly. So in this case, Trump quickly owns this trade imbalance, this increase in the trade deficit. And then we consider other data that came out this week for first quarter GDP, gross domestic product, and how this ties into the trade data. You recall from Economics 101 that gross domestic product, our annual output, is a sum of consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports minus imports. And to the extent that net export number worsens, becomes more negative, which we're talking about here for the month of March, then GDP falls. Moreover, we've seen an effort by the Trump administration, and rightly so, I believe, eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse through the executive branch, has resulted in very, very large decreases in spending. And we see that show up in the gross domestic product data for the first quarter. Real GDP for the first quarter was down 0.3%, against up 2.4% in the fourth quarter of 2024. And the primary areas that caused that drop were the large increase in imports, so worsening net exports in the GDP equation, and a drop in government spending, so dropping the G in the GDP equation. And as a result, we now have 1 quarter of negative GDP growth, 1 more quarter of negative GDP growth, and we'll be in recession. And here Trump again owns this, and this is okay. I think the Trump policies are right. The messaging is horrible. His team should be warning Americans that these efforts he's taking are going to have near-term pain. He said it sometimes. He's mentioned it a couple times. We're going to get hurt a little bit now for greater growth later. But there's no denying that the economy is going to suffer, people will suffer, jobs will suffer, income will suffer in order to correct these massive imbalances we have in the economy, primarily as we're talking today, trade and government spending. So unusually, he owns some of these things relatively early in the presidential cycle. Other things I want to mention today is Canada and the election outcome in Canada, and Mark Carney becoming the next, well, confirming his position as the prime minister, and the Liberal Party having control of the legislative branch, although not a majority control. They fell short, just shy, winning 168 out of 343 seats. This outcome, the Liberal win over the Conservative Party, seems to have been caused by President Trump. Pierre Poilievre, who was the leader of the Conservative Party in Canada, had been rising in the polls for a couple of years, had essentially had the lead, was assured victory, was widely thought to become the next prime minister of Canada. Trudeau resigned earlier in the year, and that left open this position taken over by Mark Carney without a national election, elected only by the Liberal Party. And then Mark Carney called for elections after President Trump, once elected to office, went after Canada. You're going to be the 51st state. I'm raising tariffs on Canada. Not the best public policy with respect to trade to go after our close neighbor, Canada. And that enraged Canadians and stimulated a nationalistic sentiment amongst most citizens. And since Pierre Poilievre was a conservative aligned with Trump in many ways, the Canadian electorate said, no way. We don't want any part of this 51st state stuff, these increased tariff stuff, the criticisms, the haranguing by the Trump administration. And so to some extent, I won't put a weighting on it, but there's no denying that President Trump's rhetoric meaningfully impacted Pierre Poilievre's possibilities of winning when he had the lead. He was the likely victor prior to November, December 2024. And then lastly, let me just comment again, and I've said this repeatedly, the Trump administration has the right policies. They're pursuing the right actions to help restore American strength and prosperity. They're difficult choices. They're damaging. People are going to get hurt in terms of jobs and income and families. Again, there's no way to correct the imbalances we have in our nation without pain. There's no painless solution. But his messaging is horrible. The speed at which he's going, it's fast. We've never seen anything like this. Maybe a little too fast. But on the tariffs again, just the other day, he backs off the auto tariffs again. He signed a pair of orders just the other day to soften the blow of auto tariffs with a mix of credits and other reliefs on the tariffs, recognizing that the speed at which he's imposing them is such that U.S. manufacturers can't replace imports with domestically made parts. So either bad analysis to begin with, or wrong analysis to begin with. But again, I believe this is embarrassing. This is the waffling on tariffs is not helpful. You just have to look at the major indexes in the stock market to see the ups and downs related to his rhetoric. And I keep thinking to myself, I want to see, what about insider trading? What about market manipulation? Who knows he's going to make these reversals when he does? So bad messaging or bad initial policy, one of the two. They got to sort that out for sure to temper the anxiety being engendered in the economy over tariffs. One last thing on auto parts. We had a thriving, massive, huge auto parts sector through the very early 2000s. Bill Clinton signing a permanent normal trade relations with China in 1999, their ascension to WTO in 2001, the unilateral free trade policy we imposed, the allowance for U.S. multinational corporations to literally offshore manufacturing capabilities from the U.S. to Asia, primarily China, allowed by our elected representatives, shut down that auto parts production facilities we had here in the U.S. Now we're trying to restore that to the U.S. Think about the amazing waste, misuse of scarce natural resources to transplant the capital that was here producing auto parts to Asia to produce those auto parts, and now to transfer it back to the United States. Stunning mismanagement. Horrible policy. All right, that's all I have for you right now. Always try to buy American.